you start away uneasy. You poor old sod, you see it's only me. Oh.
Hey everyone, well here we go. We're finally into the top 25 and some of the more high profile and famous solos on this list. That was Martin Barre and Jethro Tull with the solo to AQUALUNG coming in at number 25 on Guitar World Magazine's Top 100 Solos of All Time. On a list filled with fairly famous household name guitarists, there's of course a few who've made the list that aren't so well known or haven't really been that relevant in quite some time. So they have been maybe somewhat forgotten about in music and guitar circles. Martin Barre is sadly one of these players. Not a whole lot of people talk about Martin Barre these days, but he was an absolute force back in the early to mid 70s with Jethro Tull and has been cited as a major influence by many players of my generation, the old generation. Who grew up honing their chops in the late 70s and early 80s, like Steve Vai and Joe Satriani and Mark Knopfler and Dave Murray and Adrian Smith of Iron Maiden. And, a little bit later, Joe Bonamassa, a huge fan of Martin Barre. I myself, though a big fan of Jethro Tull back in the late 70s, never really zeroed in on Martin Barre as a guitarist who influenced me very much. But I'd always respected his playing. He's an immensely talented player. Jethro Tull, lots of people's knowledge of Jethro Tull these days kind of starts and stops with their rather odd and infamous victory over Metallica at the 1989 Grammy Awards for the very first hard rock heavy metal category Grammy. They shouldn't have won, of course. Metallica knew it, the audience knew it, we all knew it. Hell, Jethro Tull even knew it. They didn't even show up because despite being honored that they were nominated, they didn't actually think they were going to win. And they thought it was very odd that they were nominated in the heavy metal category. The album Crest of a Knave that gave them the win was actually a bit of a departure for the band at the time. Jethro Tull hadn't really been relevant musically at this point in their career for about 10 years. And leader Ian Anderson was coming off throat surgery and had begun singing in a lower register than previously. So they were changing their sound. The album was actually criticized by some at the time as sounding a bit too much like Dire Straits. And I actually went back and gave a listen to Crest of a Knave, and sure enough, it does sound like Dire Straits, albeit with more distorted guitars. Which just leads back to the question of why the hell were they nominated in the hard rock heavy metal category? Dire Straits would never be put in the hard rock heavy metal category, and this album sounded very much like Dire Straits. Jethro Tull weren't metal, of course. They could barely be considered hard rock, with only a handful of tracks in their entire catalog, even stuff from the 70s that, approaching anything even close to hard rock. There were a couple of songs, but not many. That said, we know what they weren't. They weren't hard rock and they weren't metal, but it's even more difficult to classify what they were. They were kind of a blend of folk music and prog, with flute solos. Odd combination indeed, but it really worked, especially in the early to mid 70s. Jethro Tull were massively popular, selling over 60 million albums. Absolute force in the music business, both in record sales and concert attendance. They were one of the biggest bands in the world during the mid 70s, up there with Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin. And a big part of that was Martin Barre, the guitar player. He wrote quite a bit of their music as well. This solo to Aqualung is easily his most famous, and is just a brilliant solo. He's using the G minor pentatonic with this one, with a few little odd notes thrown in here and there. But it's one of the more interesting and inventive uses of the pentatonic that I've ever played in like a classic rock solo. His note choices were just impeccable in this one. Oddly structured, yet very, very melodic. There's a funny story about this one, the recording of this song in particular. Jethro Tull were sharing the studio at the time with Led Zeppelin, who were in the studio recording Led Zeppelin 2. And Martin Barre hadn't met Jimmy Page as of yet and was quite excited at the prospect of possibly bumping into him during the recording session at some point. Up to the point that he was recording the song Aqualung, it hadn't happened yet. Ian Anderson, the leader of Jethro Tull, was a bit of an autocrat when it came to making decisions in the band, and that was especially true in the studio. Martin Barre was given about an hour to get the solo down to Aqualung, and if he couldn't get it done in about an hour, an Ian Anderson flute solo was going on the album in its place. Barre was basically down to his last take and had just started recording a good take, and was, a few bars into it, and finally Jimmy Page walks in and starts waving at Martin Barre from the control room. What to do? Acknowledge Jimmy Page, the man he'd been so eager to meet, and lose his last chance to get this solo on the album, or turn his back to Jimmy Page and get the job done. He obviously turned his back to Jimmy Page and finished the solo and nailed one of the greatest guitar solos in rock and roll history. The right decision, I think. I suppose he got to meet Jimmy Page afterwards. I don't know. I didn't read too much more about that, but well, that's all I've got to say about that one. Great bloody solo from Martin Barre and Jethro Tull. Well deserving of its place on this list. A classic solo, interesting, memorable, melodic, and very well played. Good stuff, really good stuff. Great solo. I hope you guys are all well in your little guitar corners of the world. I hope you like that one. Thank you as always for watching and following along on this little journey. We're getting there. I've recently cracked the 5,000 subs on my channel, and that is amazing. I especially want to thank all of those on the Our Guitar subreddit of Reddit for their support throughout this project. They are its driving force, and they make up about 90% of my subs and have been there supporting me since the beginning. So a big thank you to Our Guitar. Thank you guys. And that's all I got to say. So you guys take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time. Ciao.